Welcome to the Indigenous Voice. Today is the 20th of July, and it's a great honor to have with us Elder Tom Sampson from Tsartlip First Nation, and he is going to tell us about welcoming the refugees here on this unceded land. Elder Tom, it's very honor to have you here. Welcome to the show. Would you please tell us about the idea of welcoming the refugee on the island?
Well, we've been watching the news and the media for the last few years about refugees and the difficulties they're having in their own country. So we have our regular annual gathering here in our village on the Tsartlip Indian Reserve at the end of the month on BC Day, I think it's called. And I suggested to my family that it might be a good idea if we welcome the refugees who come to this country looking for a place to live where it's safe, and having seen the experience they went through, I thought it would be helpful for them to know that we have always welcomed, people coming to this country. Even though we don't sit on the immigration board, they still come into our land. And the funny thing about this, and I was talking to my brother on the way in, when the government first organized our people, we were put under the Minister of Immigration, in the early days. So we were considered immigrants in our own country. So eventually that got straightened out, we no longer are under the Minister of Immigration, but now we are come under the Minister of Indigenous Affairs. But what we saw about when I asked my family if we welcome the refugees from whatever country they come from, it would be a good idea to let them know that we welcomed the first refugees that came here in 1492, or probably even before that. And what we see in the people coming here to this country is people who came here, I think, in desperation, looking for a place to find peace and safety for not only themselves but their children that came with them. I think it's important that people coming to this country know who the original owners of this country, this land called North America, Canada. We've always been grateful when people come here, even though they didn't know who we were in 1492. And we've been called many things over the last 400 years, almost 500 years now. The first refugees who came here didn't recognize us. They said we looked different. They even said that we were subhuman. We weren't really human beings. And they kept calling us different names, ever from subhuman to savage.
Savages,
and
Berber.
Then eventually we got called Indian. Even though we're not from India, we got called Indians anyhow. So the government, over the years, last 400 or 500 years, have continued to make the mistake about our identity. And it's only been recently, and very recent, that the government of Canada has recognized us as Indigenous people who were here since the beginning of time. And because we know that, we've always known it, we felt that it was important for us to let the refugees coming here know that it's important to meet us. And like we did in the beginning, we looked after the first refugees. We provided food, medicine, a place to live in our land. And it's my hope that the refugees who come here will appreciate, the safety that they find here. At least I hope that's what they find. There's so much racism these days in this country and all across North America that I think refugees are actually afraid when they get here. And I've seen that in the media. We want the refugees to feel, as long as we have something to say about it, some safety should be guaranteed those people that come here, so that they don't have to go through the racism and prejudice and hatred that's in this country, because it is there, whether we say it or not. It exists, and we know it now. What we plan on doing with on the night of I think it's going to be Saturday evening of our gathering of the powwow. It's called the Yellow Wolf Pow Wow. And Yellow Wolf is an Nez Perce there. My mother was a Nez Perce woman who came to Canada to live with my father, who Coast Salish. And we come from the Yellow Wolf Chief Joseph family. And they were people who were mistreated in their country as well, and from Idaho. In fact, they declared war against the Nez Perce in the mid part of the 18th century, and a war they got into that they didn't want, but it happened. And it's all because of the misunderstanding of who we are as a people. The First Nations people, Indigenous people of this land, whether it's in Canada or the United States, the same feeling of prejudice and racism existed then, and it still exists to this day. But we want to just reach out like we did before to the refugees that are coming here and say, welcome to our community and welcome to our family gathering. And while you're here amongst our people for this weekend, you will be safe here. Nothing will happen. And that's what we want to do.
And actually, I think you are giving them a chance to start a fresh start, to know from day one the history of this land. Not like, I'm sure, but I would like to hear more about when we talk lately about the 25,000 Syrian refugee.
Well, we have lots to say, and I think this government has been forced to talk about the truth, not because the politicians say so, but because the law of the land now demands that Canada recognize the Indigenous people. They didn't do it because they wanted to. In fact, Canada and the United States was very much opposed to recognition of Indigenous people. And eventually the courts of this land said, these people have been here for tens of thousands of years, and they are indigenous to this land. So not only the countries around the world, the United Nations acknowledging Indigenous people, but the Supreme Court of this land also says the same thing. So it's been sort of, the government's been sort of forced to acknowledge, something they've ignored for 500 years. And we want the refugees coming here that we as the First Nations, the Indigenous people of this land, welcome you like we did the first refugees that came to this country early in the late part of the 14th century.
And the fact that they experience similar racism and oppression, so that they will immediately understand. But the problem when people are to know about this history, it's so difficult here. The media, everywhere around this issue, it's completely pushed aside. And I think this initiative, it's to bring it back to front, because this is, without acknowledging that history, I don't think we can go anywhere forward.
Well, there's so much for the people to know, even though the media sometimes ignores it. The people that originally lived here for thousands and thousands of years, we were never poor people. We were very, very vibrant, rich people that managed their land, the resources. And now it's different. When you watch the media these days, especially on the Aboriginal television stations, APTN, and they show what's happening to the Aboriginal people. You know, for those of us that hunted and fished, provided for ourselves, we ran against obstacles that is totally unbelievable. We spent a lot of time in jail. Our longhouses were burnt down. Our regalia were taken from us. We were forced to live in poverty, and it still exists to this moment. When you look at the northern tribes in northern part of Canada, where those people still go to the garbage dump to find their food because they can't get it anywhere else.
Anyway.
So we've faced a lot of extreme difficulties, you know, as the original people of this land. But at the same time, we recognized that maybe one day things will change, and maybe one day the people of this country now will recognize the damage that has been done, not only to the first people, our people who welcomed the refugees, but the conditions that we've been forced to live under. It's been extremely difficult. And young people who were denied the right to a language, right to their history, was all denied. And we were forced to live as Christians. And there's nothing wrong with being a Christian, except like with my great-granddaughter. I was driving her to Sunday school one day because my grandson asked me, it's my great-granddaughter, and she asked her sister, we're driving, she says, who is Jesus Christ anyhow? And said, ask Grandpa. I said, don't ask me, ask the teacher. But you see, children are asking questions. She's only 4 years old, but she went to Sunday school, and my grandchildren, that's their children, they want them to have some kind of understanding of Christianity, which is good, nothing wrong with that. And eventually they will learn like they're learning now. And we do this through the gathering that we're having on the Yellow Wolf Pow Wow days at the end of this month, August. So we'll be educating not only the refugees, but continue to educate the public about who we are and what we will always be.
Tom, is there any protocol about receiving a refugee here? Like for a refugee coming on this unceded land, is there a specific protocol or?
No, not. We've never been involved in the protocol process of welcoming foreigners to this country, refugees. It's always been the federal government of Canada and the Minister of Immigration or the Prime Minister. But from my understanding, we've never been included at any time. So because they haven't done it, our family said, okay, let's give ourselves this opportunity to welcome these people and let them know that we care. We're not going to hurt them. We're not going to create difficulty with them. And I don't know these people, you know, these refugees. I don't know their history, whether they're from Afghanistan, Pakistan, from wherever they come from. We didn't ask this question 500 years ago. We just said, come ashore. And we're going to do it again.
And we are almost out of time, Tom, but I think we are going to come back and have more update about that. You said it's in the beginning of August. Would you tell us again about the time of the event?
It's on Canada Day, I think, or BC Day. I forget the dates now, but it's right at the last weekend of the month, of this month.
Okay. The 31st of
30th
July.
and the 1st of August.
1st of August, okay? Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Tom, for being on the show, and hopefully we'll see you soon talking about the same subject.
We are going to do a ceremony in welcoming them. Yeah, I've talked to my family about that, and they said, well, we'll do a very general ceremony to welcome them.
And I will be there for sure.
Okay.
Thanks, Tom.
Well,
thanks for watching this segment, and see you in a little bit. Welcome again to the second segment of Indigenous Voice. Today we have with us Sylvia Olsen. Welcome, Sylvia.
Hi.
And we are going to talk about a very important issue. It's housing for the indigenous community, right. and which is your subject in university. Is that correct?
Yes.
So would you please tell us about why we have that kind of state of housing for indigenous people and how it started?
That's a really big question. First of all, just to limit it a bit, I've looked at indigenous housing on reserves, which is different than, say, urban housing in cities. Mm-hmm. So my study, and so I just finished a study, it's called Making Poverty, and it looks at government housing programs from 1930s to 1996 as a historian. So I looked at that, and yes, my questions were basically, how the hell did we come to this? And not just that, but how has this country sustained this debacle for so many years? Which is really the question that people ask. It's like, it's one thing to have such a problem, but for it to continue for so many years is really a mystery. It's not a mystery, but it is to most people. So for me, I got married when I was 17 and moved and have lived in a First Nation most of my adult life. And then about 20 years ago, I began to work in the field of on-reserve housing. So, and then I taught on-reserve housing management at the University of Vancouver Island. And so the question came up for me, your question, how did this come to be? And then I looked and I thought that given that this is it is probably Canada's most difficult social justice kind of problem. It has given Canada its blackest eye internationally, mm-hmm. because when Canada is looked at for its for the way it operates, on-reserve housing comes up and it's a blight. It's a blight to our country. So you would have thought that when that question that you ask, how did it come to be so, that I could go to a library and a whole lot of people would have thought about that before, right? I mean, they should have, right?
It's the obvious.
It's a big, big problem for our country. However, the truth is that nobody has actually dedicated scholarship towards it. What we know about on-reserve housing, we know from the media, and those are blitzes that journalists do, always looking at crisis. And the other thing we know about on-reserve houses is when we do a drive-by. And those two sources have given us an entirely skewed understanding of on-reserve housing. And the truth is that most Canadians have an opinion about on-reserve housing, but they don't have an understanding of it. So in like 5 minutes, how did it come to be so? Around the 1930s, Canada had a housing crisis off reserve. So we had the Depression, and we had the First World War, and Canada needed to solve its housing problem. It needed more housing, and it had poor quality housing. So Canada created a housing system that has loans, and it created institutions to support those loans so that you or other Canadians could borrow money. They thought of housing in terms of jobs because they needed to solve the job problem. So the construction industry had a lot of support and a lot of promotion. So we have loans, we have construction, and housing became Canadians' #1 wealth repository, right? So for most Canadians, their house is their largest wealth generator for them. On the reserve, and this is an answer to your question, so that's the 30s and the 40s. That's what our country did, is create a housing system based on creating wealth, generating jobs, generating money, generating houses. On the reserve, also a crisis. The population on the reserve was growing in the 30s and the 40s. Really poor housing on reserves. So what our country did is it created an absolutely separate system on reserves for how you get houses. I just described the one for most of us, and then there was a separate one on reserve, and it was based on basically a welfare sense. So it was government-controlled housing, materials, and the production of houses. Mm-hmm. And so off reserve, it was based on generating money, and on reserve, it was based on the scramble for extremely limited resources. And anybody who thinks about housing for just a couple of minutes will realize that that housing system will not generate decent housing. It can't, because there's limited resources and everybody's scrambling for them. And in truth, it is the same today almost. For most reserves in this country, they are still scrambling for limited resources and trying to build a housing system on that. And I just challenge people to just think about how that can work. And in truth, it can't. That sort of system can't work. So when I talk about housing, and my study of housing doesn't look at, it looks at it as a systematic problem. It's a systematic problem that was created in this country. And if you are on the reserve, which I have lived most of my life, you do not have access to the other system. It's not as if it's a choice. You have the system that is there on the reserve. You don't have a choice to say, oh, doesn't work for me, I think I'd like the system you're under. It doesn't exist on reserves. So when you think about why on the reserve it hasn't worked and why don't people just choose other things, it's because there is no choice. I moved to the reserve in 1972. Short story about myself. Mm-hmm. Blonde girl. My lovely husband bought a little cottage in Sydney, BC, just out here, for $12,000, went to the bank, got a mortgage, and he literally gave his very young bride, I was 17, a house. It was lovely. He's a First Nations fellow from Tsartlip First Nation. And we moved there, but he told me, we're not living here. We're not raising our children here. We're moving back to the reserve. Okay, I say, what do I know? I'm 17. That sounds good. This is lovely. Why was he so keen on moving home to his reserve? Because in 1972, Victoria was an extremely racist place. And now we can still argue about how it is still. But my memory of 1972 was there were restaurants we couldn't go in. Me, as the much younger partner, had to lead if we wanted to get into a restaurant because I was blonde. So we were in a very racist environment, and he wanted to raise his children on the reserve. So I didn't know anything about housing. Good, let's move to the reserve. That's fine. We sold the house in Sydney. Now let's move to the reserve. Oh, we can't get a mortgage on the reserve. Oh, nobody can. You can't get mortgages on the, well, how are we going to get a house? Well, there's a little subsidy. This is the government money at that point. There's a little subsidy that will build about a third of a house. It's about how big it was. It would build a third of an inexpensive house. Oh, okay, so let's get that, and that'll be a start. No, you will never qualify, because Carl, my husband, had a good job, and there was so few funds that, and he had no children, there were so few funds that the funds were reserved for the neediest people. So how? So, yeah. So you understand that now it doesn't work, right? It just doesn't work. So reserves became the places where the neediest people were the only people who could get houses. Whereas off the reserve, when you go to get a house, you have to prove actually the opposite, right? On the reserve, you have to prove, you have to qualify as the neediest. And he was never going to do that because he had a job and he didn't have 5 children already. The people who were getting the housing subsidy were people that were desperate. So we got on the reserve because I have an Uncle Charlie and he lent us the entire amount of money. But who has an Uncle Charlie? Okay, so so that's my story. And I began working on reserve and try as a housing manager to try to make this system work on the reserve. And in truth, we also often hear that if the housing projects are managed better, that it's a management problem, the programs on reserve don't work. Housing as a program doesn't work. Government making the choices about housing doesn't work. Systematically on reserve, housing does not work. And you can manage it extremely well, and it still won't provide the kind of housing that a community can want. Fundamentally, the wrong people are making the choices about how housing should be done on reserve, or has been making those choices for almost 100 years, 70 years.
So the federal government control all aspect of housing on the reserve.
So in 2016, that's difficult to say that. My study went to 1996. I was just back at the Assembly of First Nations and listening to people talking about how much the government still controls. And in truth, First Nations have a lot more administrative control over their houses. And in the last 10 years, there has been an opening up of some opportunities for them to access private funds. So the government does not control everything now, but we have got an 80-year, 70-year history and habit and a culture of housing that is not over yet. It's by any means, but there's glimpses of change. Yeah.
Do you see you said it's systematic. So
Yes.
do you see aspect or like systems like residential school, that way of having 2 standards of housing, that it's usually, isn't that natural, will an outcome when you have a colonial settler state dominating an indigenous community? Isn't usually this is the way that they're not, I mean, they're already, their land's gone. So now about having a good house, this is not, they're already in a big trouble. And now,
So, yes, it is the unsurprising result of colonization. However, what happens to things like housing, when it is framed up like that, we don't actually look at it specifically. And I think that's what's happened over the years. Is like, yeah, well, on reserve, we all expect that there should be substandard housing on reserve because that's what it's always been. And reserves are the result of colonization, so we've now come to understand that. But it's more complex than that. So my approach to this is, it isn't until we actually unpack the reality of that. Those big statements can serve actually to negate what's happening and what you see. When you drive by a reserve and you see a substandard house, just looking at it and saying that's colonization actually doesn't fill in the blanks. We have to fill in the blanks for those stories so we can come to understand them. At least I believe we do, if we're going to have solutions that work.
I agree completely with you. Usually it's the things, the look of the things are not the things
That's right.
themselves. So it's easy shortcut to say it's colonization,
That's right.
but to understand the structural relationship
right.
between that colonization system, that colonial system,
That's
and that outcome,
That's right.
that is what we need to do.
And that's exactly what I think. Colonization is a shortcut. It's handy. But what I think we're doing in our country right now, and people have very little patience actually for another story that, right? But what we are doing in our country right now is we're unpacking our history. It's uncomfortable. It doesn't make us happy. We like to think we're nice people as Canadians, and we are. So we're not that patient with our history, these sorts of histories that are showing that in fact, it's not such a good history. But I go into schools a lot, and what I say to the kids is that it's a good thing for us. It's called growing up as Canada.
Thanks, Sylvia. And
Thank
just
you.
let you know, we're out of time, but yes, it's always everything started by knowledge first.
Yeah, good. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for coming on our show. Thanks. Thanks for watching this segment of Indigenous Voice. Back to the third segment of Indigenous Voice, and in this segment we have with us Sonya Pighin, and Sonya is an Indigenous lawyer, and we are going to talk about mostly about personal perspective of Sonya about many issues, and one of them is colonialism. So, welcome Sonya to the show, and. What do you have to say about colonialism as an Indigenous person?
Well, I work right now in Aboriginal law, so I work directly with First Nations. But I also, being First Nations, to me that's my experience in it, I think, is a lot different than what a lot of lawyers' experiences in it are, who are not First Nations and maybe have different passions that are driving them. So I thought maybe I'd begin with just discussing some of the passions that I have and where they come from and where I come from, to give a little bit of context. So I am half Wet'suwet'en from Morristown. I'm part of the Bear Wolf clan, and my mother was born into that First Nation and into that clan. When she was a baby, she was scooped, they say. It was called the 60s scoop. Yeah, where I'm not sure if you guys have discussed the 60s scoop before, but it's a social policy where they took First Nations children out of their home and they adopted them into non-Aboriginal homes. So my mom was scooped, and that was after the days of residential school. Some of those policies continue today in a way because kids are still being removed through the child protection system and put into care of the government, which was my experience as a teenager. So I actually grew up in care of the government. And so there was this displacement within our family into non-Aboriginal caregiving homes. And when I was, as a result of my mom's displacement, she actually had us transferred. So in the early 80s, there was a whole bunch of transfers that happened from one First Nation band to the other, because you don't have to stay as a member of the band that you were born into. You still don't. First Nations bands have control over their own membership and who they can accept as a member or say we don't accept as a member. And so my mom had us transferred into the band in Prince George because that was the community that we lived in. So growing up, until I was a teenager, until I was put into care of the government, I actually grew up on a pretty bare chunk of reserve land. There was only us and one other family. There was an actual community living on a different parcel of reserve land. And so I grew up in the bush for half my life, with no electricity, no running water, no any kind of services really. And then I did move into town. And so my experience with growing up, I guess, was I call it just a displacement, where I was part of a community that I have no biological ties to. I had the benefit of building relationships with their elders and with their leadership and being involved in the community, which is the Tsartlip T'enneh First Nation. But I did not grow up with my own language and my own culture. So that's kind of one of the driving forces for me in life, really. At first it was getting to know myself and learning more about who I am, and then now it's trying to, I guess, stop that, putting a bit of a barrier in so that trend doesn't continue for future generations. Mm-hmm. So that's a bit about my history and my driving force, and
Actually,
I guess maybe we can talk a little bit about how that influences my work today and how I came to this.
Actually, I'm amazed about, before that, I don't know anybody can describe that, the force that motivate you. As a lawyer with a strong personality and going through all that, plus a woman in a society, you have a lot of challenges, not just an Indigenous person, also as a woman, and starting with that environment to become a lawyer in the end, and
it's quite
working
an adventure.
to change the process. I don't think anybody can describe that more.
Yeah, I mean, my experience was quite interesting. When I was 16, I was living in a group home. I think maybe there was one person in our group home who was non-Indigenous, and that's the experience as a youth in care, is that there's like 60% of youth in care are First Nations versus maybe 7 to 9% of the population, right? So it's really overrepresented as a kid in care. And in the group homes, I was living with quite a few female youth actually as well, and they were recruited as child prostitutes, so they're being exploited. They had been, quite a few of them were addicted to a lot of different drugs. And I guess why I decided, whoa, this isn't what I want. I don't want to end up being a prostitute. I don't want to end up being on welfare. You think about the typical stereotypes of a First Nations person. Mm-hmm. They're on welfare, they're lazy, they're alcoholics, they're drug addicts, and there's all these negative stereotypes. And I'd grown up with all of those. It was kind of like the expectation was that that's who I was going to become. And I just remember one day after being picked up by this guy who I think was trying to recruit me to be a child prostitute. I remember going home and just being like, that is not going to be my life. And I just decided the one thing I had control over in my life at that time was my education. And it, during my kind of, I don't know if what you call it, maybe your formative years or something before you're like 6 years old, where your development is really impacted. My mom during that key stages in my life was very healthy, and she had fought a lot of things in her life as far as personal issues and kind of come through them, and she was doing really well, and she provided us really good care. It wasn't until I was about 10 or 11 that a very traumatic event happened in our family where it triggered her and she just couldn't cope anymore, right? And so that's what led to me being in care, was that, the way I see it, a person can only handle so much in their life. And I've, experienced quite a few people who've committed suicide. I mean, the Aboriginal suicide rates are also through the roof, right? And these days I look at it as everyone has a breaking point. And thank goodness I didn't reach my breaking point at any stage in my life. Unfortunately, my mom reached her breaking point. She did turn to alcohol. She did cope with it in an unhealthy manner, but it probably is what kept her going in a way to deal with the stuff that she was dealing with. Many people commit suicide when they hit their breaking point, right? And I guess I had a lot of support in my life, in group homes especially, that allowed me not to reach that breaking point. And so I was able to move through it. And when I was throwing textbooks across the room in grade 10 because I couldn't understand math problems, there was somebody to pick it up and bring it back and say, it's okay, Sonya. And so I was really fortunate to have good staff in my group homes and to have a really good supportive circle around me. And so that I guess led me, initially I wanted to, because some of the traumatic events in my life, they had to do with criminal stuff going on. And so initially I was like, why is my family victims of this stuff? And I want to make a difference. And I thought, I'm going to be a criminal lawyer and I'm going to fight this. And, you know, I took criminology initially because I thought that's how you became a criminal lawyer, which is completely wrong. But you know, career counselors don't tell you this stuff. But it was the first step. You do need a degree to get into law school. And so I did that. And then there was a point in criminology where I was learning about restorative justice, which is where you get the victims and the offenders of crime together and you come up with what is going to be the outcome that's going to repair this relationship and make everything right again, right? And it's a healing process at the same time that originates in New Zealand with the Maori people. Mm-hmm. So when I was in criminology, I decided, well, I'm going to go to New Zealand and I'm going to learn, you know, all about this process because I did research in Canada and there's zero opportunities almost to actually have a job doing it, right? Like there's a lot of volunteer opportunities, but I mean, I also had to get paid somehow and make a living. So I moved my butt over to New Zealand and got a job actually within like 2 weeks doing restorative youth justice. And so that was my introduction to kind of, I guess, like introspection, you know, and being able to learn to be a bit more proud of being Indigenous. Because the Maori people, my first day of work, you go into this pofuri and it's this traditional ceremony where you're being welcomed into this government office that you're working at, which to me was amazing, right? Like, holy cripes, they like welcome the Indigenous people in a traditional manner into a government office. To me, that was just foreign, right? So that was pretty exciting. And then just learning about how they have Maori seats in government. They have a New Zealand Maori political party. They have the Maori language throughout all their legislation. They have Maori processes in all of their kind of integrated into their government policies and stuff. And I just thought, wow, this stuff is amazing, right? Mm-hmm. And at the same time, doing the work and learning the restorative justice stuff that I went there to learn. And then it was when I was living in New Zealand that I wrote my LSATs twice, and I didn't think I was ever going to get into law school. It was just, I was actually, went through the whole immigration process, and I was prepared to become a New Zealand citizen. Forget Canada, I'm going to New Zealand. And then I got an acceptance letter into law school and moved back to Canada and went to UVIC Law. And during my articles, after law school, you do this articling process where you spend a year working under another lawyer. It's where you do a big course, you write your bar exams, they call, you know, that's what people know them as. It's actually, they're called something different. And I articled with government, and, you know, I had spent by that point 13, 14 maybe years working in government systems, right? And I articled with government. And so I've seen the government system from being, I don't know what you want, a client or a beneficiary of their services, and I've seen it from being somebody providing the services. I've seen it from being an advocate for people who are being provided the services, and then I was right there in the legal side of it, looking at how it is all operating, right? So it's quite interesting, but at the end of articles, I ended up not working for government. They were on one of these government freezes, and I remember sitting in a meeting where they were talking about the retention and recruitment of Aboriginal employees as lawyers. And I remember sitting in there going, hello, does anybody see me here? Like, what are you talking about recruitment and retention in front of me? Like, I'm your only Aboriginal articling student, and I'm the only articling student that does not have a job with you guys yet for following my articles. And yet I'm sitting in this meeting where you're talking about this. And I remember just being infuriated and just being like, forget it. I don't want to work for them anyways. And then I started looking for jobs in private practice. And I never expected that I would practice Aboriginal law. I always thought criminal law, right? But I got a job doing Aboriginal law. And so that's what I've been doing now for the last 2 years with Cedar Law. And I work with First Nations bands and First Nations organizations, doing governance work with them, and deal with a lot of HR stuff, so employment law and land transactions and basically anything that they throw at you. It's kind of like an in-house counsel role where anything that the band needs, you help them with.
And actually that could be the subject for our next interview, because I think you have a lot to say, Sonya. Sonya, we're out of time, but thanks a lot for coming on the show. We did not talk about colonialism as we thought we were going to, but again, I'm sure we'll have more time in the future.
It had more to do with colonialism than you might think.
Thanks for watching this segment of Indigenous Voice. Welcome to this segment of Indigenous Voice. Today we have with us Jeff Ward, and Jeff, he's going to talk about a proposal he has in regard to the Aboriginal National Day. Hi, Jeff.
Hey.
And just to be sure, Jeff, he's the CEO of Animikii. Am I saying it right?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Would you please tell us what is your proposal in regard to Aboriginal Day?
Sure.
Day?
Yeah. So National Aboriginal Day, June 21st. Of course, we just had this this special event across Canada. So as a small business owner myself, looking at what days do we give our staff, our employees off? Looking at, there are many days that we have to give off that are kind of federally mandated, and we have some provincially as well. National Aboriginal Day, June 21st. It was the Governor General in 1996 proclaimed this day to be a special day, but it's not a statutory holiday, right? So employees across the country, they have to go to work. There are a lot of events that are happening going on around the country, and if you're stuck behind a desk, you're not going to be able to appreciate and go to these events and check out these awesome events going on. However, in the Northwest Territories, they have National Aboriginal Day since 2001 as a stat holiday, right? So I wrote an article for the Globe and Mail, and I ended up doing quite a bit of radio appearances across Canada. And in speaking with some folks up in Northwest Territories, this is they actually get the day off. It's a stat holiday. It's totally normal to them that June 21st is a day off. So my proposal is maybe it's time we kind of relook at the days that we give off in this country to employees and workers, and maybe June 21st is one of those days.
I agree with you completely, especially when we have, for example, as a good friend of mine remind me, when we have Victoria Day. So why not to have National Aboriginal Day? I mean,
yeah.
And it's 1996, as you said, it's just 20 years ago to be proposed.
Yeah, I mean, Northwest Territories in 2001 made it a stat. So they didn't wait as long as the rest of the country. The Yukon, I learned just this last December, they are talking about, they're putting it on the table for discussion. So they're considering it. And I think it's just a matter of time before all of the provinces sort of follow suit.
Is that related to the process of truth and reconciliation, you think? Is it kind of could be part of that?
Yeah.
Acknowledging?
Yeah, so I think right now it's a very interesting time in Canada. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, of course, has just concluded, and they released calls to action, right? So there are calls to action for all kinds of different sectors, for government, for education, for businesses even. One of those calls to action was for a new stat holiday that they proposed called the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. So this is a day that has been proposed, and so it's just, and our government, our current government has committed to all of the calls to action. So a stat holiday being one of those days. Should there be a new day that is created, or should it be June 21st? So I think that's a discussion that we need to have.
Coming back to the name itself, I am not really I'm not sure about how the term Aboriginal, I know there is a lot of discussion regarding like whether native, indigenous, Aboriginal. I know United Nations have some protective measure for indigenous people.
Yeah.
So here when we talk about Aboriginal, do you think it's the proper term to have?
So it's called National Aboriginal Day, right? So, so I created a video that has kind of gone viral a little bit, and I talk about National Aboriginal Day a lot. And in the end, I sort of make a little comment about National Indigenous Day. Maybe this is a better term for it, okay? Just to kind of throw in a little, to just talk about the terms that we use to describe us as Indigenous people. A lot in the last year, couple of years, you hear the word Indigenous being used a lot more. And I believe this relates to the United Nations. They have a Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So that word Indigenous, may have some legal meaning, and our government has said they're going to be adopting this. So I think that's an important distinction to make. So the word Aboriginal in Canada, it means it's an all-encompassing word that means First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, right? So within First Nations, for example, we have many nations, many cultures. For example, you have Cree, Ojibwe, a lot of Coast Salish nations out here. For example, Songhees Nation, right? And I think what most are asking for, and what I've seen is if you're working with a nation, use their name, use their nation name whenever possible. But Aboriginal, first of all, Indian was the word in our Constitution, and we still have the Indian Act. Of course, we know, that the word Indian and where that came from, the false assumptions, just sort of stuck. You have Aboriginal, which if you look at the etymology of that word, Aboriginal, not original. So there's some etymological sort of things to think about there. But I think Indigenous is a good, if people are wondering, I think that's a good safe word to use, and wherever possible use the specific nation name.
Actually, one of the reasons of this show, we call it Indigenous Voice, because for all these indigenous community around the world, even if they look distinct and different from each other, but in the end they are facing the same kind of faith, we could say, or the same process of colonization, or using the term of the outsider to describe themselves. It's happening everywhere. And the first time I heard about the Aboriginal was actually from in Australia, talking about the similarity between terms like Aboriginal, abuse, abnormal. So why not original? So this is another. So this is part of acknowledging the past to go through the process of reconciliation. Yeah. You agree about that?
Yes, absolutely. And just looping it back to National Aboriginal Day, a day in the spirit of reconciliation, I think a day set aside for education, for Indigenous and settlers to connect in meaningful ways, I think is so important. And there are, like I said, a lot of people stuck behind desks that they're not able to go, or event organizers sort of have to do hacks and work around the weekend. Or here in Victoria, we had a couple days before the actual day, had events then. On the actual day of the 21st, there was still events happening around, and because we take the day off at our company, we were able to go and check it out. We pulled my kids out of school, and we went to some events on a Tuesday.
Beside that proposal, I'm sure other idea came up to your mind in regard to this process. Is there any other idea similar to that proposal?
Sorry, in terms of?
To propose National Aboriginal Day to become a statutory day. So is there similar kind of thought came to your mind that to help in the process of acknowledging the back history and to go on, as you said, between the settler society and the indigenous society? is there other ideas similar to that?
Other ideas? Yeah, so one other example in the Truth and Reconciliation call to action for businesses, and because I'm being a small business owner, I'm very business-minded, and what kind of corporate culture do we want to have? All of our staff in our company take Indigenous cultural safety training. Mm-hmm. So we work mostly with Indigenous groups. We're an Indigenous technology company, Indigenous owned, and so all of our staff, even our contractors, we sort of encourage them. We require this training. So another idea is educating, right? I think education is the cure to a lot of ignorance, especially in our country. Mm-hmm. National Aboriginal will help. National Day for Truth and Reconciliation will help. Businesses, government, if we're able to provide opportunities for all Canadians to learn about the true history of our country, we're all going to be in a better spot for it.
I agree with you, and I think we need more of these days instead of, when we have a day like Victoria Day, we better acknowledge that the history of this land and the Indigenous people and their history on this land. Yeah. Jeff, thanks a lot for coming to this interview.
Thank you.
And hopefully we'll talk more later about that proposal.
Sounds good.
Great,
thank you.
Thanks for watching this segment of Indigenous Voice.